Chinese Exclusion Act, formerly Immigration Act of 1882, U.S. federal law that was the first and only major federal legislation to explicitly suspend immigration for a specific nationality. The Basic Exclusion Law prohibited Chinese laborers, defined as both skilled and unskilled laborers and Chinese employed in mining, from entering the country. Subsequent amendments to the law prevented Chinese laborers who had left the United States from returning. The passage of the act represented the outcome of years of racial hostility and anti-immigrant agitation by white Americans, set the precedent for later restrictions against immigration of other nationalities, and started a new era in which the United States changed from a country that welcomed almost all immigrants to a gatekeeping one. During the California Gold Rush in 1848 to 1855, Chinese people began to immigrate in higher numbers to the state of California. A large proportion of Chinese immigrants began building the infrastructure that was needed for the first transcontinental railroad. After the Civil War subsided, the economy began to decline and many Americans blamed the Chinese for limited availability. Anti-Chinese movements and animosity had started to take place, with some newspapers creating racist and vile anti-Chinese political cartoons. The United States have thrown the Western world into an attitude of unfriendliness by keeping Chinese people away and practically cutting off their communication with China. The exclusion laws as well as the increased regulation of Asian immigration severely damaged transnational relations. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was a turning point in American history. The act barred all Chinese from U.S. citizenships by naturalization, and specifically excluded Chinese laborers and their families from entering the United States. Immigration based on race and class was now an official part of American public policy. It opened the door to subsequent racially biased restrictions and outright exclusions of other immigrant groups. The Exclusion Act was a pivotal point in U.S. immigration history. The impact most definitely reverberated throughout the Asian Pacific region as the United States subsequently restricted and or excluded immigrants of Japanese, Korean, Filipino, and American Indian descent. America closed its doors to more and more immigrants for reasons of race, ethnicity, and country of origin. The Chinese considered American exclusion grossly unjust and discriminatory. Boycotts of American goods were organized in large Chinese communities as far away as Philippines. Chinese diplomats in Hong Kong and community organizations in America submit letters complaining about degrading practices and mistreatment by immigration officials. It was a policy founded in ignorance and arising through passion, an error which American people didn't understand that it was distinctly a policy of disaster to the United States, where the widespread detriment and harm occurred and deprived their country of annual income of millions of dollars in the absence of business with China. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a bold yet cowardly law. It was the brainchild of bitter and irrational resentment and contradicted America's policy of caring for the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses yearning to be free. The Chinese Exclusion Act contributed to the creation of Chinatowns across the U.S. places where Chinese immigrants could feel safe. Chinese immigrants moved to many locations across several nations, thus helping to shape the entire exclusion era. Chinese migrants usually maintain significant socio-economic, political, and cultural ties with their native heritage, including the families and homeland, in spite of pressing legal barriers that placed limitations on Chinese immigration to North America. Chinese immigrants live their lives across international borders. One relative lived in China while others lived in America. They were rarely able to see one another for fear of being denied entry or re-entry into the United States. Ultimately, the need for a scapegoat led to America's economic woes. As aforementioned, the post-Civil War reconstruction required much money and resources, and few people other than the Chinese were willing and able to provide the manual labor and hard work. Thus, by limiting Chinese immigration, Americans were suffocating their own economy. America, as a powerful nation, should become more accepting and embrace differences of other countries and its citizens. Associate with people whose background differ from their own. It is vital to know the history of the nation and learn from it. If this path is taken, perhaps the United States will thrive even more as one of the great political and economic powers of the world. From the incident of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Perhaps Americans can learn not to be so eager finding scapegoats and seek to solve problems at the actual source, not by blaming others. Chinese Americans have made tremendous contributions to the development of the United States. However, obstacles were wrongfully introduced to hamper their integration. Learning from the past will help us understand the present, and only by learning from prior mistakes can we make informed decisions about what courses of action to take in the future. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 remains even today as one of the most racially induced legal limitations in the history of the United States. The act had a significant impact on both Chinese and Americans. It was implemented during a time of great prejudice and blind racism. America as a whole tends to, in desperate economic times, target minority groups or other certain groups to blame, such as in this case when the Chinamen were credited with depressing wages. The Chinese people were not the ones at fault. The Civil War left America in ruins, and the Chinese were there to expedite the recovery with their inexpensive and diligent labor. The act ruined the relationship between Chinese and American community. With each historical parallel, lessons can be learned, and by recognizing the mistakes of racial tensions can America be true an inclusive democratic country.